To get started, I usually have been asking just one question to each of the panelists, just to get the ball rolling, and then things usually take off from there. And we'd like to obviously open up questions for the audience. So Dennis, I thought I'd start with you, since Manitoba has been working on developing a social impact bond. Maybe you could talk a little bit about why Manitoba has chosen to experiment with this financing model, and if you are doing something differently than what we've seen in the film, what would you point out?
Yeah, great. So thanks for having me here. We're, I guess, probably about 8 to 10 months into the work that the Manitoba government's been doing at looking at doing social impact bonds, and I think part of what we've made a really conscious choice to do is to be very open and transparent about our process, to do a lot of talking to people, to try to take advantage of some of the lessons that are learned, because I think stands out in that movie, the first social impact bond in the world was 2010. We're in a new world, but it's I think the conversation is something that we really welcome. So we started our process with an open call to anyone who is interested to come and show up if you're interested in doing a social impact bond, talk a little bit about what they are, and take questions from people. We had about 150 individuals show up to our first meeting, which showed a lot of interest in it. And I think what's interesting to us about the concept is it's an exciting way potentially to fund some of the best ideas that are out there to crack the really tough, persistent social problems that we haven't been able to crack now with some of our programming. So Manitoba, we've got a lot of problems in child welfare delivery and poverty and justice and that type of thing. And we have a lot of people that come into our offices quite a bit when you do my type of work, and they say, I've got a really good idea. This is something that we've come up with that could do a really good job. And what you end up doing in government is saying, how can we fund this? Does this maybe fit into this grant program? Maybe you can adjust it a little bit so that you can access this grant money, or maybe we end something else that we're doing to fund this program. It's actually really difficult when you have a really good idea in front of you sometimes to find a way to support that. So to us, a social impact bond is a tool that we can use. It's one tool, but it's a tool that we can use to fund some of those really good ideas that are out there. And it's a tool that we can use in government to start thinking a little bit differently about those things that we do fund when we start talking about what are the outcomes of this project and what usually happens, and then starting to take a look at our own data of what that is. That whole process is a really exciting one for us. So we see this as something with a lot of potential, but we're not unaware of the concerns that are out there and some of the lessons learned from some of the SIBs, so we're paying close attention to that. And if I had one thing from the movie that kind of stood out to me, was the amount of emphasis on investment and the returns to investor that was a part of that movie. So I've been doing this for, again, kind of starting to conceptualize the idea and then working proactively on this for probably over a year. That conversation about investors needing returns and what are investors gonna want is really probably number 6 or 7 on the list of the things that are the focus of our conversations. I think in the US, where some of those were focused, it's a little bit different because they do a lot of large-scale social impact bonds with a lot of big investors. But the investment piece is something where we've got a lot of people telling us they're interested. No one's talking to us about the returns that they want when they open up those conversations, and I guess that was kind of my one takeaway.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Tara, let me bring you in now, because you did answer the RFP. Mm-hmm. What made your organization interested in testing this model, or potentially testing it if you're chosen, because it hasn't been decided yet, correct? Who's going forward?
That's correct, yeah. The notion of the social impact bond, our direction that the provincial government expressed to our sector, I guess you could say, in early 2017, was not one that we had anticipated, but we had done some research on it and had looked at it from the perspective as this is what we're going to have to deal with moving forward with the provincial government, and how can we make this work. And like Dennis said, you know, our organizations and agencies in our system, I work in the child welfare system, and have really great ideas, and they're doing really great on-the-ground things in their communities and with the clients that they serve. Those things are hard to recognize with the way that funding is allocated and the way that grants are distributed amongst our system, whether they come provincially or federally. Our organization, which serves 10 child and family services agencies, First Nation agencies in southern Manitoba, has some very unique features about it. Our aim is to support those agencies. There's a lot of reform activities happening now at many different levels. There's reform activities happening at the provincial level, at the federal level, and also within the First Nation jurisdictional levels. And working with the government, you have to work through all those many different lenses, and you can get really caught up in all of those. Our vision and our mission in our organization is, to do what we can do today, because our children and our families need those services today. And they're not thinking about all of the political discussions and implications that are happening. They're thinking about, how can I be with my family today? And our province has a very poor record of separating Indigenous children from their parents, and we work in a system now that is, operated and run by Indigenous agencies. We support our agencies also by some of the things that are highlighted in the SIB, in the social impact bond strategies, such as identifying metrics and methodologies to measure outcomes and measure the interventions. And those things are important because our agencies do a lot of good work at prevention, but we have a learning curve to look at how are we measuring that. And all of that's associated with cost. And, so we fall in the spectrum of, where we almost feel blamed for spending all the money that the government gives us to house our children. And we are really keen to look at methods at preserving and keeping families and restoring and reclaiming some of those ways that have been taken from us over many hundreds of years. That's the perspective we come from. We looked at this as an opportunity to access funding to deliver a program and to measure it effectively. And it wasn't our first choice, or maybe it was our first choice, but it was at that time really what was an opportunity to us. This is my second time watching this film. I had the opportunity to watch it in Ottawa in the spring. I was happy to come and watch it again, with aged a little more in this process and understanding and having done some more background research. We have a lot of really good people in Manitoba here that we consult with. And we also, listen, to our leaders and to our communities who, in the same token, want these services and want their children back. So those are, some of the things that have led us to this decision. And all the while, we're also learning about the implications more at the level of how these things are funded and the expectations of the governments. We have had those expectations of the government for many years. And, we need to look at ways to understand what our options are.
Let me just bring Sandra in here. Many of the organizations in your organization, many of the nonprofits in your organization are also looking at this. It's being presented to them. The Manitoba government says it intends to put out more RFPs. I'm just wondering, what are your members saying? What are you hearing, Sandra?
Well, we actually haven't had any representation from the government, so I can't potentially speak to that. But I guess Certainly it is something, it's very seductive for individuals who work in the nonprofit sector because funding is not always easy for new projects. But I guess I also want to be clear that there's an implication that in the nonprofit sector we aren't held accountable for the funds that we get. We actually have to provide rigorous reports to all of our funders. Every year we have to fill out forms, we have to tell them what we do. We don't just get a blank check and go forward. I think that certainly it needs to be explored. I don't think you close the door on anything, but whatever needs to take place has to be transparent. And from my point of view, I would need to have a comfort level with the ethical policies of anyone advancing a social impact bond. So certainly we are different from the United States. I'm somewhat glad of that. But I look at the issue, and so I see Goldman Sachs was quite there. And if I was in Goldman Sachs, I would probably be trying to do everything I could to atone for what I had done to many Americans in the subprime crisis. And I also see that a number of the people who are talking about investing in social impact bonds from some of these are companies that also get hired to do studies of government services and traditionally recommend that those services be privatized. So that causes me some concern. I don't think you close the door, but I think you need to know, and I think you need to have a comfort level that whoever you want to make an investment with understands you, understands the needs, but I also think they have to understand that the clients that are served have to have a voice. And I would not want to live in a world where individuals who access social services are treated as commodities. I also think, and it concerns me, that if I look at the history of this country, we spent a long time putting our version of history and life and expecting the Indigenous community, who already had lives and communities, and expecting them to live by our standards. I don't necessarily think that we've done a good job of how we've treated Indigenous people in this country, and I think that we need to be sure that whatever we do, the communities that we serve are the communities that are consulted, and that their values are recognized.
Thank you. And Stephen, maybe you could talk a little bit about McConnell does a lot of philanthropic giving. And so I'm wondering, why is it interesting to a foundation to work in this space where it's an investment model and the social services that you already donate to?
Thank you for the question. And let me also just say that I think this is a really necessary conversation to be having in Canada, that we can't simply accept the model without looking at it critically from the perspective of community, from the perspective of the people working in the social systems. Those are essential components of the conversation that we have to have about how we might or might not deploy this particular tool. So from a philanthropic perspective, we realized some time ago that the grant economy is insufficient to moving the needle on some of the things that we care about and that we face together, the challenges we face as a country. We've begun to and have made significant steps towards investing our own endowment in social and environmental goods, in the social enterprise sector, in companies and initiatives that are designed to have a blended return. So yes, a financial return, but sometimes not. Sometimes a planned loss or 0% interest rate, just because we see needs, places where we need to put capital to work to create change. We have partnerships with Indigenous communities and initiatives where we start out by granting, and then we move to zero interest loans. And under Canadian law, if we lose money on those what are called program-related investments, we get to call those donations. So the government has made it easy for us to put capital to work at creating change, in the case that I'm thinking of, at building owned housing on Indigenous reserves, something you're not supposed to be able to do but that the Huron have developed a model and that we're co-investing with them and intend to take that to further scale. So I guess the point is, we not only make grants, and we work with United Ways and community foundations and partners in communities, but we're really trying to change systems here. And a social impact bond is just one more tool among many to put the resources that we need to work in service of social, environmental, community goods. And I think I should just maybe quickly say that here in Winnipeg, our involvement in developing the social finance marketplace begins with our partnership with United Way and the Winnipeg Boldness Initiative, where for several years now, we've supported an effort for community to consult its elders, parents, executive directors of research, of social agencies, researchers, to look at alternatives or possibilities for improving outcomes for children and families. So their voice comes first. I have to confess, when we first came here, we had it backwards. We sent somebody in here to look at, where can we do a social impact bond? That was a stupid thing to do. I readily admit it. We were told to stop doing it, and we got it. We listened, and we've spent 4 years patiently supporting community consultations. And I think we have, through Boldness and other consultations, some pretty exciting ideas to test that are really, I think, suitable for a social impact bond approach. Some of them are risky, some may lose money, but the point is, if they're community guided, community supported, and transparently applied, as you said, we have a chance to introduce some very promising new ways of getting things done here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I could open it up to the audience if there's questions. Is there a question for anyone on the panel? Sorry, yeah.
I guess Dennis. Sorry. So we looked at it from Goldman Sachs is coming in and providing a service, or one of these companies, and then the government's returning the money. Are the social impact bonds that Manitoba's developing, is that the way they're doing it? Or is it that the government of Manitoba is providing the money to them and they're expecting the money back? Or are they expecting a return on investment? Or are they partnering with a private firm?
So it's a great question, and I think part of it was when we started this, we had to ask those same questions. I'll just answer that with how we actually did approach the social impact bond. So we reached out to everyone when we decided that child welfare was going to be our area that we wanted to do the first one. We reached out to anyone who we thought might have an interest in that space, and that was within the sector, that was outside of the sector, people that provide services to them. We invited them to a forum to say, here's what social impact bonds are. If you're interested, you can start thinking about them. They're not for everything and they're not for every project, but in some cases they are a good fit. Then we kind of stepped back for a little bit and let groups think about that, and then we issued a call to say, who's got a social impact bond idea? It's one of the things I really like about social impact bond is that the ideas are coming, they came flooding in from people that work in these areas, and they had some really good ideas for what solutions could be. We went through those, we came to a list of a few that were very promising, and then you start working with the groups in terms of, okay, to make this work in a social impact bond, how are we defining the target population? How are we, what is the outcome that we're after? Are there measurements of that outcome? Is there evidence of your success, et cetera? And then you get into really good conversations about program design. And for us in child welfare, it was very much about, this is about kids doing better. How do we ensure that the outcomes that we're after are meaningfully considering that the children are doing better? And then designing the project. Once we have a project that's ready to go, then you'll go on to the next step to say, investors, are you interested in investing in that? And we haven't got to that step yet where we've formally done that with any investors. The idea is that they'll put up the money to fund the project. At the front end, we'll have agreed upon our outcomes that we're striving for and that we're willing to pay for. The program will run, it will be evaluated, independently evaluated, and if it achieves the outcomes that it was set out to test, we'll pay back the investors a few years from now on the money that they put up front with a return, which to me, we've been having a lot of conversations with foundations. That this isn't charitable capital, this is capital that's usually invested to help fund out a portion in charitable giving or whatever they do each year. So the return is basically kind of what they would have, offsetting them for the loss that they pulled that capital out of their investment portfolio for 3 years to fund this project, where it could have been getting them a return. So it's basically to offset that is kind of how we're looking at the return element of it.
So what is that internal return that the foundations or the philanthropic groups that you're talking to normally getting on the market?
Yeah, again, you may think that I'm just saying this for the audience, but we had a meeting today with a few people that were interested in investing, and the return rate didn't come up during the conversation. I think generally there's a sense out there to have some sort of return comparable to what that capital would have been doing otherwise, but I've seen it in a range from 4% to 20+% in the United States. And so there's a different set of ranges, and I think depending on the project and who the investors are, there's a different willingness to...
Maybe Stephen could speak to that.
If I may, just to say, we're working on something currently with energy transformation from diesel to geothermal, and we're looking at if everything works at a 4% return. And we're pretty happy about that because we're not really just in it for the money, we're in it for the impact, the environmental and social impact, the fact that those communities will end up with community-owned power systems that are sustainable for 50 years of geothermal installations. That's a pretty good return, pretty good social return. And I think from government's perspective, from philanthropy's perspective, and from the private sector investors who are willing to invest that way, it makes sense for us all to be working together. I think one of the interesting things about the film is that you can see that as sectors, we're still trying to understand each other. We're still going, well, you can't talk that way, or you need to understand what it's like on the front lines here. You make sure we need to be heard, and there has to be this kind of conversation and this kind of sharing of values and understanding of motivation and some regard for what are the limits here? What do we say is appropriate and what isn't? So, but that. I don't know of any impact, social impact, but I think in the one we're invested in with heart and stroke, I think our max return, you could be wrong, I think is 6%, but it's not...
8.8.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay. Stand corrected. See, I don't know why we would have to be paid that much, frankly. Why is it 8 point? Is it because the savings to the health system are so great?
Well, they did it. It's funny, with the heart and stroke, when they were figuring out what the ROI would be, they didn't even do a cost analysis. So they basically did something that Mars calls a cost plus analysis. So they determined what it would cost to deliver the program, and then they just tacked a percentage on top. And a lot of it is often tied to the internal rate of return that the investors are used to getting.
Right.
In order to, to transfer money into this type of investment, that's what they're looking for. So here's a question.
I have a question for you because I'm watching the film and my heart rate is escalated. I'm so alarmed by the language, the commercialization, the obsession with quantification, the metric, even the way in which the teacher works, the testing mechanisms, the ROI, so deeply offended in every way possible. And then people say, well, it's America. Canadians often say, well, it's America, so that we'll feel better. I don't know how easy that is to sit with. But then there's a reasonable sort of discourse here that makes me feel, oh, okay, so it's not really the end of the world, as I understand it. But, we lean on that a lot. And then underneath it is always, these are large and complex problems. We're just hitting, a lip here and there, right, to make us feel just a bit better about an outcome here and there without understanding how integrated this system is, and all the various forces. You're sitting here as the filmmaker in a Canadian landscape, listening to the discourse that is developing. Do we need a Canadian documentary, a Canadian-based documentary to help us understand this Canadian landscape in relationship to an American landscape and the various cultures that sit side by side to understand what it is we do when we think of investment and the commercialization of giving, quote unquote?
Well, I think the examples in the film, I mean, there were 2 Canadian examples, and you heard Mainstay, when they were at Deloitte, they were looking at a 10.25% return. And they were also talking about payment triggers. And you saw the impact that investors had on the heart and stroke, determining that enrollment would be part of an investment trigger.
But those big voices, you know, that big guy sitting in the suit.
J.B.
right?
Pritzker, yes.
Those were very big voices and
Yes.
presences, you know. They kind of defined the architecture and the landscape for me, which is where my blood pressure went. And so how did it feel for you? How does it feel for you?
Well, you mean how do I personally feel
Yeah,
about
how do
social
you-
impact
yeah.
bonds?
Yeah, how do you, yeah. How do you feel in, you know, because you're sitting
Yeah.
in these various environments.
I have to
isn't
say, the conversation we're having here is the tamest that we have
it? Yeah, I
had.
wondered.
It is. I personally have a lot, I think they're problematic, and I find it difficult to wrap my head around why the government would be doing this. Because, I mean, people call it funding, but it's not funding, it's a financing tool, right? Because the government pays the money back, and then they say, well, they only pay it back if the program actually delivers results. But what we've seen, and you heard the woman from Brookings Institution, they did the study on all of them, these are not risky investments. And so then I asked, well, why doesn't the government just borrow the money? Because the borrowing rate's so low now. If they really are cash strapped and they just need to pilot these new programs, why don't they borrow it? So I am not convinced that this is the right way to go. And I think it introduces a lot of problems. I mean, even if you look at how funding is distributed to schools in the United States, you know, a lot of it is based on marks and student performance. And you see that teachers will, even subconsciously, you know, bell curve marks, change it, because they need, it's the same sort of situation that Tara's in, they need the funding. And they don't want to see the people that they're helping left without. So I'm conflicted about it, but the big booming voices, I think that's just America. You know, that's how Americans are. Sorry.
I have
Yeah.
a question on cost. When you have this notoria of accountants and lawyers that are setting up these deals, these IPOs in a way, so there's a lot of cost involved in something like this. That would be my concern. What is the percentage? I mean, obviously you're in a foundation, you're probably managing it pretty good. But the government, nah, maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, did you want, so I can say my piece.
Let's put
so-
the government on the hot seat.
Hey, absolutely. It's not as, when you hear people talk about social impact bonds, sometimes you'll hear it very much oversimplified, and it's not simple. And I think they said in the movie it takes, on average, 18 months for a social impact bond to,
Right, and I see
to
that
get going.
team of accountants, high-priced accountants, and man, that meter just starts ticking.
Yeah, absolutely. So our experience, I can tell you from our experience, is it hasn't been that much. Like that hasn't been a huge component of the program. We hired a consultant at the Government of Manitoba to help us with our work. The Mars Centre for Impact Investing, who was the intermediary in the Heart and Stroke Foundation SIB, so an organization with experience doing this. We hired them on a contract to help us not only get our first SIB going, but learn about SIBs within our government and teach us. And within their contract, they're helping us get the SIB off the ground, do the work with investors, and support the organizations that are looking to take their concepts into something that's kind of refined and SIB ready.
How much did you raise, and what was the percentage costs of that issue?
So we haven't done the raising money yet. So that'll come when we announce the social impact bond. That's when we're ready to solicit in of that next stage. So I know what the cost to get us to this point was, which I think is kind of the 2/3 to 3/4 mark of the process, and then included in the contract we already have is that next step of work of working with the investors. So we don't anticipate anything beyond the one contract that we're in as a Government of Manitoba cost.
Because I'm not hearing.
Yeah, well, I think we did a contract for up to $150,000, which
150,000.
up to 100, but that was for not only the work brokering a first social impact
What
bond.
is the percentage of that offering? Like that,
It would be
the
a
amount of money
yeah.
raised. Let's be a little bit tangible here. The money that you need to raise Okay, how much is it? I
It
mean,
would be a
just
very-
using this example,
Yeah, I
because
think-
know very little about
I think,
it.
again, because the SIP's not finalized, it's hard for me to tell you exactly. Right now, we're looking at a really, really small percentage of it, probably in the
What's the amount, do you know?
2% range-ish is what's
How
coming to
much?
mind. Probably 2% of what the amount raised.
2% cost of the capital?
2% of the amount raised is what went into this work that you're talking about.
Just to fees?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a question in the back, yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, my interest in, thank you for coming to Winnipeg and doing the film, and I appreciate the importance of this topic. I represent a public union, and we have over 25 different workplaces that work in the social services and do this kind of work day in and day out. And I'm just having a difficult time grasping what the long-term plan of social impact bonds is here. As you attested, the government can typically borrow money at a much lower rate. You speak about innovation. Winnipeg was one of the host sites, for example, of the at-home Stay Schwab projects, which did a lot of the testing that was similar to what we saw in Toronto, and demonstrated that we had an 80% reduction in homelessness in the city. That was a publicly funded study.
Yes, yeah.
That there's the innovation there. We have the research.
It's interesting, that research was the baseline that Deloitte was using to figure out what the targets would be for mainstay. So, but this is the point that the Brookings lady was making, that there's not a lot of risk being taken, and it's not surprising, or it's not hard to understand that investors aren't going to want to invest in something that has no track record.
Not only that, but I see risk in the model. I see risk in the service to those providing the services, because we're looking at service drift now. We're drifting away from, we have other people coming in and defining what those standards should be.
Mission drift of the
Mission drift with
nonprofits, yeah.
Profit behind it, right?
And that's what
I
Bridget
see
talked
risk
about.
for the participants. So I'm not sure what the long-term plan is, because it feels like the only reason that the social impact bond model would work is for the same reason that money marks work, in the sense that we have such a depleted economy that this is a hostage negotiation in a lot of ways. This isn't an issue of funding. This is an issue of taxation and people being able to have healthy public services provided by a government. So I want to know what the long-term plan is for social impact bonds as they continue to perforate the market here, and what that means for public services.
Did you want to direct that question to anyone in particular?
Again, sure.
Yeah.
We have four. No, so it's good. I quite enjoy the conversation. I think just to, again, on that first piece of some of the costs that we've incurred, I'm also not anticipating that it costs that much every time, because this was a contract to show us for the first time what is a SIB, and so I don't think we'll have to do that the next time. So just to throw that out there. But I think we have a lot of large, complex social problems that are really tough to crack. And I think, you look at the introduction of a lot of government programs and you see huge drops. You see seniors' poverty dropping down from 16 to 5%. You see huge progress coming in from social programs, but then there's still people that fall through the cracks of the programs that are available because their needs are complex. The issues that are confronting them are complex, are often interrelated, and the government programs that were available to them didn't give them the kind of tailored, unique support that they need. Those people generally, just the way it is, those end up falling to our nonprofit sector in our society. But what we have is a situation where most of our charities and our nonprofits don't have enough money to go beyond 2 months of operation if they were to have their funding cut off. And their opportunities for funding are donations, government programs, and that's generally been it. What's exciting about this is that it opens the door to a market of capital that's been completely elusive to maybe not all of these groups, but a lot of these groups for a really long time. But to talk about these problems, these complex, why are so many people in child welfare, a SIB isn't going to be the answer. The answers are going to be in better integration of our government programs. It's going to be in improving our models of how we fund nonprofits. But a SIB can be an exciting way within that to take some innovative ideas and get capital for them. And then the government's able to look at that program and monitor how it works, and look at the data and the results and use that to inform future decision making. So I mean, there's a lot of promise within those concepts. It's not going to be the perfect answer to the problems that we're talking about, but it can be a piece of that picture of how do we do better for some of our most pressing social problems.
Just a question, the lady here, yeah.
Thanks. I do work in social services, but I'm a probation officer, so I work in justice too. So my clients, I see everything. I see the poverty, I see the drug addiction, I see the mental illness, I see kids being taken away from my clients. I have youth that come in my office that have been in trouble. So with the social impact bonds, what I worry about is that, and I've already seen a scaling back of the services that I can even find for my clients. More than being a probation officer, I'm a rural probation officer up in the parkland. I'm lucky if my client, once they wait 2 weeks for intake for mental health, has to wait another 6 weeks before they can actually see a counselor. So why aren't those programs being funded already fully? And if you want to look into the innovative stuff later on top of a fully funded social system, super. Right? But what I'm worried about is this government is going to look at these, get them to such an extent that they rely on them as an excuse to privatize while they've depleted our social services so we look like a bunch of failures. The public sector is not working. They're going to do that, and then they're going to centralize them all to Winnipeg. What am I going to do with my clients? What am I going to tell them when they don't have anything?
Yeah, I think it's a valid set of concerns. I guess my response would just be that I don't look at it where it's a conversation of one or the other. We can have conversations about it improving the where you work in the areas that you work on, and we can have conversations about doing social impact bonds. And I don't see those two as canceling each other out in any way. So I think if you're looking at SIBs within the current climate of the government trying to get the deficit under control, not even the first SIB that we're talking about is in the immediate horizon for cost savings for the government. This is years out. So all I can tell you is that what's driving us to do this isn't cost savings. We want to do a social impact bond because they sound like a promising idea, and then because there's cost savings, that's a way that we're able to access funding that otherwise might not be accessible. But we're really not looking at it as an either or type of conversation.
Yeah. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
I'm going to stand for this one. I love the film.
Thank you.
It was a great film. Tells a great story. LaToya was the main story in my mind on that piece. And as a filmmaker, I'm a filmmaker. The climax is at the end. and I know it because I've grown up in the child welfare system. I've kept my kids out of it. I work with Tara. And I could say that the outcome, the climax of that film at the end is Reginald. It helped him. It's an outcome. It worked for him. And I think that that's what we're looking at. And you're talking about all the people you can't serve. We're in the same boat. But this is an opportunity for us to move forward with a program that we believe is going to keep those mothers together, right, in our program. So I think that as a filmmaker, it's a great film, and I would hope that you stand behind it.
Stand behind the film?
Stand behind the message of the film.
What is the message of the film?
You tell me. It's about the outcomes. It's not about money. It's about outcomes.
It is about outcomes.
Yes, it's not about money.
But I think the financing model may not always deliver the
Does it
outcomes
work?
we want.
Does it work? Did it work for Reginald?
No.
We don't know.
You don't know?
No.
It's not over.
Grade
What
one.
did the film say?
What I was trying to show with Reginald's story is that there's
Thank
a
you.
number of other things happening in his community that impact his life. And so trying to focus on that one program and say that we have success. I mean, you must know this in the work that you do.
The metrics, the measurements showed it. Did it not?
On Reginald's mother, you never talked about that she could go to work or anything like that because he was in daycare. What was the impact on the family? Was she working? Was she on social assistance? What was the social impact on her having that daycare available to her?
LaTanya is actually in a very good situation compared to most of the people in that neighborhood. I mean, she lives in a tenement building where her grandfather owns it, and her mom and dad live there, and her grandparents. So they're in the 3 stories of that house. So there's a lot of support, and she has 7 children. So her older kids are able to take care of the kids. She is working. She works a very, she worked basically on call, driving cars for a rental company, like relocating them all over the city. So oftentimes she doesn't come home at night. She works odd hours, but
So
she does
before
work.
this bond, what was her situation?
She was doing the same, but she had her family support. But a lot of people in that neighborhood don't work at all.
So why didn't you choose a family that would have been better impacted by this?
Well, actually, the program requires that the parents spend volunteer hours at the school. And so them not working and being able to spend that time with their kids is actually encouraged by the school.
Okay.
We have time for one more question.
Sure.
I know it's early days, but has there been a negotiation, or do you plan in Manitoba to have some kind of a plan for, say, at the end of the social impact bond, if you're paying back, you know, you're getting your returns, and you have great outcomes and it's a huge success. Are there plans for sustainability? Would the government commit to then, because the risk has been sort of eliminated, would they agree to continually fund a program like that? Of course.
Yeah, so
He's getting encouragement here.
yeah, no. I think that's part of the discussion that happens is on what we found is a lot of groups came to us with an idea for a solution. This is a solution that works. How much does that cost? How long does that take to work? What is the outcome? Who are we serving? That kind of feeds the next conversation. And then with the people that we've been working with this on.
Negotiation, will there be any talk about sustainability of the program if it delivers on its outcomes?
Yeah, so for the next stage after the program gets
Would
worked
that
on.
be government, or would that continue to be like investors?
Yes, so I know that from our perspective in picking, trying to pick what the social impact bond would be, that was something that we looked at. So it was to say, if this is successful, is this something that we can scale and then grow and expand, or does it end and then it just ends? So, and what we're working on with Tara would be something that if it works, it can go broader. We can look at federal partnerships. There's lots of different opportunities, but the benefit of it is that the case that I could see us making towards the end of this for extension is to be able not to say just that this is a good program, we think. It's to say these are the actual outcomes that we achieved, and to the point that was made earlier. What's really exciting about this, and even just this conversation that we've had right here, because I really enjoyed this, but I think this model opens up the conversation about outcomes in a way that isn't typically had in my experience in how government grants and programming are run. So we're all sitting here talking about, is that the real outcome? Did that really help those kids? Did you have the right type? And those are the hard questions, but those are the questions that this model allows you to start really talking about and getting better at. So I think just the idea that we're not just talking about, did you serve 100 people? Did you serve 100 dinners? Did you do this? Is to say, did they get healthier? Were they with their families longer? Did they do better in school? Can we attribute that to the program or something else? That's a really exciting conversation. And we're just in the infant stages of it, but there's a lot of potential in those types of conversations.
Tara, did you still want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple comments to Dennis's, because as I was invited to be on the panel because we have been working with the provincial government over the past several months on this, to hopefully be identified as the first landmark SIB. And along with that, we've also been, weighing the risks and the pros and the cons. Our relationship with the provincial government, has been, challenging to say the least over, many years. When the government came out with this idea, their they were part of, you know, many other, you know, I would refer to them as pillars because that's what you refer to them as, but, you know, pillars that, you know, that we're going to base, you know, the change on in the child welfare system. Our system and our leadership is, is calling out for, province to back off and move away, and give us our inherent right. So one of the things that was, attractive was that, the government is committing to a process where they are going to stay out of the legalities and the bureaucracy, which we are enshrined with in every other way. Like the proposal that we have on the table right now is only looking at one issue in our system, and the issues that are plagued, with our, within our child welfare system are many and they're complex. And so along with, negotiating and talking and having weekly discussions and, just, trying to establish some kind of a relationship and even trust, we still have, mountains of issues and mandated responsibilities that we have to carry through with the limitations that currently exist. I wanted to also mention that when we birthed this idea, it was a partnership with an organization that was actually formed through the Boldness Project. It was grounded in our beliefs and our teachings, from our elders, and our beliefs as women, that if you teach our women these things that have been taken from us, we can build better families. And those are teachings, that have been lost, erased, and we have to reclaim. That is really a driving force. We know what the risks are. We have the same risks. We're not dealing with, in all of the literature and everything that I reviewed today, again, to prepare for this, some of the criticisms are, the investors will pick, things that aren't challenging. Well, we're not presenting something that's easy. We're challenging the government to keep to their commitment. We know that we know our program will be successful, and we know that it has scalability, and we have our people on board. So it is from those stories, like the story that, that touched me as well was the story of Reginald, because my whole career has been working with kids, and my whole life, my family, is those kinds of stories. And we need to move ahead, and we also can't continue to rely on, the same old. We need to challenge, and have our governments keep their word. And in our negotiations and in our 8 months, we've had lots of back and forth. We've had lots of discussions about, outcomes and metrics and measurements, and we protect the vision that we came forward with will not be moved around, infiltrated, or cut in half to meet the needs of, the government's plan for social impact bonds. So that's, I wanted to add that, and Dennis and I haven't always been best friends, but
Is that why I'm seated between you?
But we have a lot of discussions, and our even coming and sitting here is because we know that the government should be doing better, and our conditions and our reality right now is a result of the government not doing better and not doing well to reconcile with our people. And I would echo my colleagues' comments, and it's if it keeps a family together, then then who cares? Who cares where the money comes from? And our commitment to our elders and to our families is that we'll go through whatever we need to get these kinds of things funded. These kinds of things that bring us back our culture and our teachings and the way that we need to respect ourselves as men and women and raise our children and to preserve our families.
I think we have to leave.
Thank you very much.